Maya Williams navigated the empty highway outside Austin in the dead of night. Her sedan's headlights cut through the fog, illuminating a world both familiar and indifferent. She was tired, every muscle aching from hours of driving. Ahead, a lone Texaco station flickered in the darkness, a beacon in the emptiness. She eased the car into the pump lane, hoping for a brief moment of reprieve. Officer Derek Shaw stepped from the shadows, boots scraping the cracked concrete. His eyes fixed on her, cold and unyielding. "Get out of here, now," he barked. Maya took a deep breath. "I'm almost done," she said softly, hands steady on the fuel nozzle. Shaw laughed sharply, humorless. "Not here," he said. Behind him, Officer Cole Briggs remained near the patrol car, unease flickering across his face. Maya's voice remained calm. "I've been driving for hours. I just need a few more minutes." She glanced at the empty highway behind her. Shaw advanced. "You think you can negotiate?" he muttered. "I'm asking for courtesy," she replied, voice thinner now. Shaw stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "You want courtesy? Then you should have stayed in your part of town." Maya swallowed, the words tight in her chest. She refused to give in to fear. "I'm a paying customer, that's all that matters here." Shaw's jaw tightened. "No," he said, "that's not how it works." Then, without warning, he demanded her ID. Maya refused without cause. Shaw seized her arm, pulling her off balance. The fuel nozzle slipped. "Stop, please," she gasped. Briggs stepped forward, but Shaw ignored him, forcing Maya to the ground beside her car. Panic surged in her chest. "I'm not resisting. You're hurting me." Shaw's grip tightened briefly, then he released her, leaving her shaken, trying to steady herself on the cold concrete. "I just want to go home," she whispered. Shaw looked down at her, detached. "You should have thought about that before you stopped here." Maya struggled to rise, hands trembling. The night wasn't over. The encounter had left its mark physically and emotionally. Hours later, she was home, her body aching, bruises forming on her forearm. She opened her case file for the next morning's hearing, a habit more than curiosity. And then she saw the names: Derek Shaw, Cole Briggs. The case involved allegations of officers in Oak Haven County stopping black drivers, intimidating them, taking cash under false pretenses, and burying complaints. Shaw wasn't just a witness, he was central. Maya didn't call anyone, didn't request reassignment. She had learned that speaking too early could undermine justice. She slept little, reviewing her docket with meticulous care. The courtroom was ready. By morning, the hearing began. Attorneys poised, plaintiffs prepared with records and sworn statements. Shaw leaned back, coffee in hand, smirking as though the morning belonged to him. "This is all smoke," he muttered, his confidence unshaken. Maya entered, taking her seat at the bench. Shaw saw her, and his face went pale. The cup slipped from his hand, spilling across his papers. Briggs turned, following his gaze. The woman from the gas station, the one they had degraded, now sat above them, robe flowing, authority undeniable. Maya let the silence settle. Then, in a voice measured and precise, she commanded order. The courtroom understood. The moment had shifted. The men they thought untouchable were no longer in control. Power had been redefined. The hearing, begun as a procedural matter, had already become a reckoning. Witnesses would testify, truths would unfold, and the system itself would be forced to confront the harm it had allowed. Maya's strength was not vengeance. It was the authority of law aligned with conscience, ensuring that fear could no longer silence the vulnerable. The hearing began with the first witness, Dana Mercer, a former dispatcher for Oak Haven County Sheriff's Department. She approached the stand, carrying a sealed envelope of records, her face calm, professional, accustomed to being overlooked until her testimony mattered. Ellis asked her about her duties, and she confirmed she handled officer check-ins, vehicle plate requests, and field activity notes, including those of Shaw and Briggs. When asked about unusual patterns, she detailed how Shaw often ran plate checks before formal stops, frequently targeting black drivers with no corresponding infraction. Maya overruled the weak defense objections, allowing Mercer's testimony to stand. The room fell into attentive silence as Ellis walked the court through dispatch logs, showing delays between plate checks and stops, a pattern pointing to selective enforcement. Each piece of evidence layered the story, corroborating witness statements and building a compelling narrative of abuse and racial targeting. Mercer explained she had reported concerns internally, but nothing was done. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, realizing the weight of repeated inaction and implicit complicity by supervisors. As Dana stepped down, the second witness, Lorraine Bishop, rose, describing a nighttime stop with her grandson. She recounted Shaw's intimidation, his demands for money, and the absence of formal documentation, receipts, or legal basis. Her calm, measured voice belied the trauma, and the courtroom listened with stunned silence. Ellis presented further witnesses: Reggie Coleman, who paid $800 to avoid fabricated charges, and Patrice Miller, a home health aide, who faced invasive threats. Each testimony aligned with the previous, forming a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. Briggs, visibly shaken, eventually took the stand, admitting to participating in withholding documentation and turning off cameras under Shaw's instructions. Meyer allowed his testimony to continue without interruption, understanding the human toll and ethical collapse that had permitted this behavior. Shaw's arrogance crumbled with each corroboration. His confidence, once absolute, eroded as the systemic pattern became undeniable. The defense could no longer obstruct or redirect. The record spoke for itself. Meyer's presence, her calm authority, and her insistence on procedural integrity amplified the weight of truth entering the court. By the end of the day, the summary charts, authenticated logs, and witness accounts had exposed a machinery of coercion, racial targeting, and corruption. The court's adjournment left no illusions of control for Shaw and Briggs. For the first time, they confronted the consequences of actions previously protected by silence and habit. The city outside continued as always, yet within the courthouse, a precedent had been quietly established. Deliberate misconduct would no longer evade scrutiny, and those who had been powerless were finally represented by law. Meyer's measured decisions, the careful sequencing of testimony, and the transparent presentation of evidence set the stage for a broader reckoning, ensuring that systemic abuse could not continue unchallenged. As the courtroom emptied, reporters, witnesses, and attorneys absorbed the significance of what had transpired. Understanding that the ordinary mechanics of law had intersected with extraordinary courage to illuminate what had long been hidden in the dark corridors of authority. By the following morning, the courthouse was a different place. Derek Shaw arrived early, his uniform crisp but his demeanor brittle, the arrogance of the previous day replaced by a hard, uneasy silence. Cole Briggs followed separately, his posture hollow, shadowed by fear and fatigue. Meyer entered the courtroom with the calm authority that had carried her through the prior hearings. She took her seat, acknowledging neither the gallery nor the defense directly, yet every eye was on her. Ellis called the next witness, Dana Mercer, to the stand. She explained how Shaw and Briggs routinely ran pretextual plate checks on black drivers, often long before a stop was formally logged. The patterns were deliberate: delayed entries, selective targeting, and the consistent absence of legitimate cause. Meyer allowed every detail to enter the record, her measured responses ensuring no defense objection could derail the narrative. As witness after witness recounted coerced payments, threats, and intimidation, the room understood a systematic, calculated pattern. Briggs's testimony exposed his own complicity. Camera deactivation, omission of reports, and instruction from Shaw to exploit fear. Each acknowledgement tightened the noose around Shaw's credibility, revealing a culture of impunity previously shielded by authority and silence. Meyer's calm command of proceedings amplified the impact, forcing both officers and the court to confront the reality that misconduct had been routine and unchallenged. The audience, reporters, and legal professionals alike recognized the gravity of the evidence. Independent witness accounts, corroborated logs, and internal communications formed a cohesive narrative of abuse, with Shaw at the center and Briggs as enabler. By mid-afternoon, the summary charts and exhibits laid bare a machinery of coercion and racialized enforcement. The county attorney and union counsel could only observe as the testimony dismantled their client's defense. The adjournment at 3:30 left a courtroom still, but the implications were seismic. No one could ignore what had been revealed. Meyer's decisions, procedural rigor, and insistence on accurate testimony had created a record that could not be dismissed. Outside, Austin moved through its daily rhythm, oblivious to the institutional reckoning unfolding within the courthouse walls. Inside, however, the record had been set, and those who had once operated in the shadows were now exposed to accountability. Every witness, note, and log confirmed the pattern: selective targeting, intimidation, and abuse under color of law. For Shaw and Briggs, the illusion of control had ended. For Meyer, the work had only begun. The legal system, long deferred by fear and tradition, was being compelled to recognize the truth. And for those who had been silenced, the record now spoke on their behalf, ensuring that the ordinary mechanics of law met the extraordinary weight of evidence and courage. The next witness, Lorraine Bishop, took the stand with a composed dignity that belied the trauma of her experience. She recounted traveling north on Route 17 with her grandson late after a doctor's appointment when they were stopped by Shaw. He questioned her lane change, made veiled threats regarding her grandson, and demanded $500 in cash, none of which was documented or accompanied by a receipt. The courtroom absorbed the testimony in silence, the weight of systemic abuse apparent in every pause and inflection. Ellis allowed each word to settle, ensuring the pattern became undeniable: coercion, intimidation, and selective targeting. Reggie Coleman followed, detailing an $800 payment to avoid fabricated charges, while Patrice Miller testified about an invasive encounter and threats meant to enforce compliance through fear. Each narrative, different yet consistent, painted a broader picture of misconduct and abuse under color of law. Meyer's presence, her unwavering attention to procedure, reinforced the integrity of the record. Cole Briggs, eventually called to testify, admitted to his role in concealing actions, keeping cameras off, and following Shaw's instructions to exploit the vulnerability of drivers. His confession was quiet but devastating, exposing the depth of collusion. Shaw's demeanor, once brimming with arrogance, eroded with every corroborated statement and piece of evidence. By mid-afternoon, the room was no longer just witnessing isolated incidents. It was seeing a pattern of corruption, racial targeting, and abuse fully documented. Meyer ensured every testimony, every log, and every note became part of the formal record, demonstrating that systemic failure allowed such behavior to persist. The day's adjournment left no room for misinterpretation. The law had intersected with accountability, and those previously protected by fear and silence were now subject to scrutiny. For the officers, the illusion of impunity had ended. For the victims and witnesses, the record now gave voice and weight to experiences long ignored. The courtroom had become a place where the ordinary mechanics of law met extraordinary courage, ensuring truth could no longer be deferred or dismissed. As Meyer left the bench, she understood the consequences of her decisions. The exposure of the pattern would ripple outward, compelling institutional reckoning and setting a precedent for the protection of the vulnerable against abuse of authority. By mid-morning, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. Meyer's steady presence on the bench had set a tone of authority that even the most seasoned officers could not defy. Ellis called Dana Mercer back to the stand to corroborate and clarify dispatch logs, confirming that plate checks were disproportionately targeting black drivers, often well before formal stops were recorded. Each document, time-stamped and notarized, reinforced the systematic nature of the misconduct. The gallery, once filled with indifferent observers, now leaned forward, absorbing the procedural details and human impact alike. Cole Briggs, still visibly shaken, was called to explain his complicity: how cameras had been deliberately deactivated, reports withheld, and discretionary enforcement twisted into coercion. His testimony revealed a web of coordinated abuses designed to exploit vulnerability, all under the guise of standard procedure. Shaw's composure, once invulnerable, had all but collapsed. The reality of his actions, recorded and witnessed, had stripped him of any remaining authority in the room. Meyer's rulings on objections, her measured enforcement of courtroom protocol, amplified the weight of truth entering the record. Each admission, each corroborating log, and each witness statement tightened the narrative, leaving no room for denial or diversion. By lunch, it was evident to every attorney, reporter, and observer: this case had transcended individual misdeeds and revealed a systemic pattern of abuse and racialized targeting. The record, meticulously curated by Meyer and Ellis, left the officers exposed, their previous shield of impunity stripped away. Adjournment at midday did not dissipate the tension. It allowed reflection. Outside the courthouse, Austin continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the seismic accountability taking place within. Inside, the combination of evidence, testimony, and authoritative oversight had created a precedent. Misconduct could no longer hide behind routine or fear, and the vulnerable now had a voice codified in the legal record. Maya reviewed each exhibit with quiet determination, aware that the system's response in the following days would determine whether justice could act beyond this courtroom. The unfolding events made clear that this was not simply about Shaw and Briggs, but about establishing a culture of transparency, accountability, and the imperative that no individual's power could silence the truth. When the afternoon session began, Maya took her seat with the same controlled precision she had exhibited all week. The courtroom was quiet, every observer aware that the prior testimony had stripped the officers of any pretense of dominance. Ellis called the next witness, an older woman named Lorraine Bishop, who recounted the night she had been stopped on Route 17 with her grandson. She described the intimidation, the coercive demand for money, and the absence of any legitimate documentation. Her calm, unwavering testimony resonated through the gallery, confirming the systemic pattern of abuse that Shaw and Briggs had perpetuated. Reggie Coleman, a truck driver, and Patrice Miller, a home health aide, followed, each giving consistent, detailed accounts of harassment and financial exploitation. The audience, once skeptical, now absorbed the weight of evidence with growing unease. Cole Briggs was called to provide his account, revealing how he had facilitated misconduct by deactivating cameras and following Shaw's instructions to exploit vulnerable drivers. Maya allowed the testimony to continue uninterrupted, understanding the psychological toll of confession and the importance of a complete record. Shaw's composure, already fractured, eroded further as the scope of his and Briggs' coordinated actions became undeniable. With every log, affidavit, and witness, the court built a meticulous record demonstrating a pattern of racialized enforcement, coercion, and corruption. The procedural rigor and controlled authority Maya maintained ensured the integrity of the testimony, leaving no room for obfuscation. By the end of the session, it was clear to all in the courtroom the officers had been operating under a shield of impunity, but that shield had been pierced. The adjournment allowed the court, the legal teams, and the witnesses to reflect on the gravity of what had been revealed. Outside, Austin carried on unaware, while inside, the system was being compelled to confront the consequences of negligence and systemic abuse. Maya reviewed the exhibits, noting the patterns, the missing documentation, and the repeated instructions to conceal misconduct. The record was no longer just a compilation of isolated incidents. It had become a blueprint of systemic failure, demanding accountability beyond the courtroom. Those who had once believed power alone could protect them now faced the inevitable scrutiny of law and oversight, and the foundation for a historic reckoning had been laid. The following morning, the courthouse felt heavier, the air thick with anticipation. Derek Shaw entered through the side door, his uniform neat but his demeanor tense, stripped of the arrogance he had carried the day before. Cole Briggs arrived separately, carrying a legal pad and an expression that revealed the long night spent reckoning with his own actions. Maya entered calmly, taking her seat at the bench with the quiet authority that had guided the prior sessions. The courtroom fell silent as Ellis called Dana Mercer to testify about plate check patterns and pretextual stops targeting black drivers. Each document she presented, time-stamped and notarized, reinforced the deliberate nature of the misconduct. As Mercer spoke, the gallery absorbed the testimony, understanding the significance of what had previously been dismissed as routine. Briggs took the stand to confirm his own complicity. Camera deactivations, omitted reports, and following Shaw's instructions to exploit fear. Each admission deepened the exposure of coordinated abuse and dismantled the defense's narrative. Shaw's face tightened as the systematic pattern of coercion became undeniable, leaving him cornered in a courtroom that had once seemed pliable. Maya's precise rulings on objections, her calm enforcement of protocol, amplified the power of the truth entering the record. By late morning, the cumulative weight of witness accounts, logs, and internal communications made clear that this was not an isolated incident, but a sustained pattern of racialized enforcement and abuse of authority. The courtroom became a record of accountability, with every participant aware that the ordinary mechanics of law had intersected with extraordinary courage. As Maya reviewed the exhibits and testimony, she understood that the ripple effects would reach far beyond the courtroom walls. Institutional oversight would be forced to act, and the long-standing shield of impunity would begin to collapse. By the time the morning session ended, the record was unassailable, leaving Shaw and Briggs to confront the inevitability of consequence and setting a precedent for the protection of those previously rendered powerless. By midday, the courtroom had become a crucible of accountability. Maya presided with calm precision as Ellis called additional witnesses, each detailing the coercion and racialized targeting executed by Shaw and enabled by Briggs. Testimony from civilian drivers, including financial extortion under threat, aligned with internal logs and dispatch records, creating a cohesive pattern of misconduct. Briggs admitted to deliberate omissions, camera deactivations, and following Shaw's instructions to exploit vulnerable motorists. Shaw's composure continued to erode as the evidence accumulated, revealing a systematic pattern of abuse under color of law. The gallery leaned forward, reporters scribbled furiously, and the courtroom staff absorbed the weight of the unfolding record. Maya's enforcement of procedural rules ensured the testimony could not be undermined by technical objections, leaving the defense scrambling to respond. By the afternoon, the summary exhibits displayed a consistent pattern: delayed stops, selective targeting, unlogged encounters, missing receipts, and repeated harassment of black motorists. The record now clearly demonstrated that Shaw's and Briggs's actions were neither isolated nor incidental, but a coordinated system of exploitation. The adjournment at mid-afternoon allowed the courtroom and observers to reflect on the magnitude of institutional failure that had allowed such behavior to persist. Outside, Austin carried on its usual rhythm, unaware of the transformation inside the courthouse. Inside, however, the system itself was being forced to confront complicity, indifference, and abuse, with Maya ensuring the record was thorough and unassailable. The evidence had crystallized a pattern that could no longer be ignored, and the implications would extend beyond the immediate hearing. The officers who had relied on fear and habit for protection were now fully exposed, and the foundational work for systemic accountability had been laid. Maya's vigilance and command of the courtroom ensured that the record not only captured the individual acts, but also the broader structural misconduct that had allowed these abuses to continue unchecked. The next morning, the courtroom brimmed with tension. Maya took her seat at the bench, her calm presence commanding attention. Ellis called Dana Mercer back to testify regarding plate checks and pretextual stops, confirming repeated targeting of black motorists. Each piece of evidence, time-stamped logs, notarized entries, and corroborating witness accounts reinforced the systematic nature of Shaw and Briggs's misconduct. Briggs, visibly shaken, admitted to disabling cameras, omitting reports, and following Shaw's instructions to exploit fear. Maya allowed his testimony to proceed, emphasizing the importance of an unbroken record of truth. Shaw's composure deteriorated further, the weight of repeated admissions exposing his prior arrogance as hollow. The gallery absorbed each detail, understanding the pattern. Selective enforcement, intimidation, coercion, and financial exploitation were not anomalies, but routine. Maya's precise rulings ensured the testimony remained intact, despite weak defense objections. By mid-morning, the combination of sworn statements and records painted a cohesive picture of systemic abuse, challenging the institutional protections that had previously shielded the officers. Witnesses like Lorraine Bishop, Reggie Coleman, and Patrice Miller recounted coerced payments, threats, and intimidation, their voices aligning in consistency. The procedural rigor Maya maintained amplified the testimony's credibility, leaving the defense unable to disrupt the narrative. By lunch, the pattern of misconduct was unmistakable, with every admission, affidavit, and record contributing to a compelling, undeniable account. Outside, Austin went about its normal pace, unaware that inside the courthouse, institutional accountability had been forced into daylight. The evidence laid the groundwork for ongoing investigation and systemic review. Shaw and Briggs, once confident in their immunity, now faced the reality of exposure. Maya's meticulous approach ensured that the record captured both individual transgressions and the broader structural failures that had permitted these abuses to persist, setting a precedent for justice that extended beyond the courtroom walls. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom was saturated with the weight of evidence and witness testimony. Maya presided with unflinching calm as Ellis called the dispatcher, Dana Mercer, to detail plate checks and pretextual stops on black drivers. Time-stamped logs and internal notes revealed a pattern of deliberate targeting, extending the systemic abuse beyond isolated incidents. Cole Briggs, still visibly shaken, admitted his complicity, deactivating cameras, omitting reports, and obeying Shaw's instructions to exploit vulnerable motorists. Each admission dismantled the defense narrative, leaving Shaw increasingly cornered. The gallery leaned forward, absorbing the full scope of the misconduct, while the reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every nuance of testimony. Maya's rulings maintained procedural integrity, allowing the record to fully reflect the systematic nature of abuse. By late afternoon, the summary charts and corroborated logs displayed the depth of repeated misconduct. Discretionary stops heavily skewed toward black motorists, missing documentation, inconsistent camera use, and coerced financial settlements. The court adjourned briefly, but the impact of the evidence resonated throughout the room. Outside, life in Austin continued as usual, yet inside the courthouse, a foundational reckoning was underway. Maya's meticulous attention to record-keeping ensured that the narrative of systemic abuse was indisputable. The officers, once shielded by authority and habitual fear, were exposed to the consequences of coordinated misconduct. The hearings had evolved into more than individual accountability. They were demonstrating institutional failure and setting precedent for broader oversight. Each witness, document, and procedural ruling contributed to an unassailable record, compelling recognition of a pattern of racialized coercion and abuse. By the time the courtroom emptied, it was clear that the exposure of Shaw and Briggs was only the beginning, and the ripple effects would extend through internal reviews, state investigations, and potential federal oversight, ensuring that the law would now follow through where fear and silence had previously prevailed. When the following morning began, the courthouse brimmed with anticipation. Maya took her seat at the bench, her calm and precise demeanor reinforcing the gravity of the proceedings. Ellis called the next witness, Dana Mercer, to testify further on plate checks and pretextual stops. The logs and dispatch records corroborated her prior testimony, showing targeted stops of black drivers long before official records reflected any law enforcement action. Briggs was called again, and he admitted his continued participation in covering up these practices, including disabling body cameras and following Shaw's instructions to exploit vulnerable motorists. Each admission chipped away at Shaw's credibility, and the gallery could sense the unraveling of his facade. Shaw, once confident and defiant, sat rigid, his composure deteriorating under the weight of cumulative testimony. Witness after witness, including Bishop, Coleman, and Miller, reiterated the coercion, threats, and undocumented financial demands, establishing a pattern of abuse beyond isolated incidents. Maya's firm rulings ensured all relevant evidence remained in the record, allowing the courtroom to witness the full scope of misconduct. By late morning, the evidence clearly demonstrated systemic abuse, racialized targeting, and institutional failure to prevent or address these practices. Observers, reporters, and legal professionals all understood that the case had evolved from individual wrongdoing to institutional reckoning. The adjournment in the afternoon provided a pause, yet the courtroom's energy remained taut with the consequences of exposing long-standing misconduct. Maya reviewed exhibits and witness testimony, ensuring the record reflected both individual accountability and structural failures. Outside, Austin continued its routine, oblivious to the profound institutional scrutiny taking place within the courthouse. Inside, the law had intersected with transparency and moral courage, creating a permanent record that would challenge the impunity previously afforded to Shaw and Briggs and lay the groundwork for ongoing investigations and systemic reform. As the afternoon session commenced, Maya took her place on the bench with the same unshakable calm that had characterized the prior days. Ellis proceeded to call additional witnesses who reinforced the pattern of abuse and racial targeting established by prior testimony. Dispatch records, logs, and affidavits confirmed that Shaw and Briggs systematically chose which drivers to stop and manipulated discretionary enforcement to coerce money or compliance. Briggs admitted to knowingly deactivating cameras and omitting documentation under Shaw's direction, further solidifying the scope of coordinated misconduct. The courtroom absorbed each revelation with increasing gravity. Even the most seasoned observers recognized the systemic nature of the violations. Shaw's composure, once confident and commanding, now appeared fragile and defensive. His prior authority dissolved by the mounting evidence. Meyer maintained strict control over the proceedings, allowing no procedural interference to obscure the unfolding record. By late afternoon, summary exhibits and witness testimony had demonstrated the repeated, intentional exploitation of black motorists, the deliberate failure to document actions, and the use of intimidation and coercion. The adjournment left the courthouse quiet but heavy with the implications of the day's revelations. Outside, life continued in Austin, indifferent to the institutional reckoning occurring within. Inside, however, the law and ethical oversight had intersected with courage and meticulous procedure, creating an unassailable record. Shaw and Briggs were no longer shielded by habit or fear. The narrative now codified the broader systemic misconduct. Meyer's careful orchestration of testimony, evidence, and courtroom procedure had established accountability and transparency, ensuring the abuses could no longer be dismissed, ignored, or hidden. The record reflected both individual wrongdoing and institutional failure, setting the stage for subsequent investigations, civil remedies, and long-term reforms. By the next morning, tension in the courthouse had escalated. Meyer assumed her position on the bench with the steady composure that had come to define the proceedings. Witnesses were called, each reinforcing the systemic misconduct orchestrated by Shaw and enabled by Briggs. Dispatch logs, field notes, and sworn affidavits detailed repeated, premeditated targeting of black motorists, coercive financial demands, and consistent failure to document encounters. Briggs admitted his complicity, acknowledging camera deactivations and omission of reports under Shaw's direction. Each revelation chipped away at Shaw's authority, leaving him exposed before the court and gallery. The courtroom absorbed the weight of these revelations. Reporters documented every detail, and the staff recognized the historic significance of the testimony. Meyer's procedural precision ensured that every admission, record, and witness statement became part of an unassailable legal record. By mid-morning, it was evident that the evidence portrayed a coordinated pattern of racialized intimidation and abuse, no longer a matter of individual misconduct. Shaw's composure faltered under the scrutiny, while Briggs's confessions underscored the systemic failure that had allowed this behavior to persist. Meyer's rulings and oversight maintained the integrity of the hearing, preventing procedural tactics from undermining the record. By the afternoon, the compiled evidence, logs, witness accounts, internal communications, had laid bare the extent of the corruption, inertia, and coercion. The adjournment provided a brief pause, yet the implications were clear. Institutional accountability had been set into motion. Outside, Austin continued its everyday rhythms, oblivious to the unfolding reckoning. Inside, however, the law and ethical oversight had intersected with courage and diligence, ensuring that the abuses could no longer be ignored, and setting the stage for systemic review, civil remedies, and a broader evaluation of enforcement practices. By mid-morning, the courtroom had become intensely focused on the consequences of systemic misconduct. Meyer presided with unwavering calm, guiding the hearing through each witness account and piece of evidence. Dispatch records, officer logs, and sworn affidavits consistently revealed that Shaw and Briggs had engaged in racially targeted stops, coercive financial demands, and deliberate failure to document encounters. Briggs admitted to complying with Shaw's instructions, deactivating body cameras, and omitting reports to exploit vulnerable drivers. Each admission further dismantled Shaw's credibility, exposing the coordinated nature of the abuse. Witnesses, including Lorraine Bishop, Reggie Coleman, Dirayen, and Patrice Miller, provided accounts that reinforced the documented patterns, making the misconduct undeniable. Meyer's precise rulings on procedural objections ensured the record remained intact, leaving the defense unable to obscure the evidence. The courtroom, reporters, and staff recognized that this was no longer an isolated case of misconduct. It was a structural failure, a pattern of abuse maintained by fear and institutional inaction. By mid-afternoon, summary exhibits and charts demonstrated consistent, systemic exploitation of black motorists, documenting missing reports, inconsistent camera use, and repeated intimidation. The adjournment left the courthouse quietly tense, with everyone aware that the exposure of these patterns would have lasting consequences. Outside, the city continued its routine, unaware of the systemic reckoning unfolding within the courthouse walls. Inside, the law, procedural rigor, and courage had intersected to ensure accountability. Shaw and Briggs were fully exposed, and the court's meticulous documentation set a precedent for ongoing investigations, civil remedies, and long-term institutional reform. Meyer's deliberate orchestration of testimony and evidence ensured that systemic misconduct could no longer be ignored, establishing an unassailable record for justice to follow beyond the immediate proceedings. The final day of the hearing unfolded with an air of quiet intensity. Meyer took her seat at the bench, fully aware that the culmination of days of testimony and evidence would determine not just individual accountability, but the precedent for systemic reform. Witnesses were called to confirm prior statements, their narratives reinforcing the consistent pattern of racial targeting, coercive enforcement, and procedural misconduct by Shaw and Briggs. Each log, affidavit, and sworn statement aligned with previous testimony, leaving no room for doubt. Briggs admitted his ongoing compliance with Shaw's instructions, including deactivating cameras and omitting reports to facilitate exploitation of vulnerable motorists. Shaw, once confident and unassailable, sat diminished, confronted by a record that could no longer be denied or evaded. Meyer's firm rulings on procedural objections ensured the integrity of the evidence, allowing the full scope of misconduct to enter the record. By mid-morning, the patterns were undeniable: selective enforcement based on race, coercion for financial gain, and systemic institutional failures. Witness accounts, internal logs, and corroborated records combined to demonstrate a sustained operation of abuse under color of law. The courtroom absorbed the weight of these revelations, reporters documenting every word, staff noting the historic significance, and the officers realizing the consequences of exposure. By the afternoon, summary charts and exhibits illustrated repeated misconduct, missing documentation, and intimidation tactics, leaving Shaw and Briggs fully accountable before the court and public scrutiny. The adjournment marked not the end but a threshold. Institutional review, civil remedies, and potential federal oversight would follow. Meyer ensured the record captured both individual wrongdoing and systemic failure, establishing a blueprint for accountability. As the courtroom emptied, observers understood that justice had been asserted through meticulous documentation, courageous testimony, and procedural integrity. The exposure of systemic misconduct, once hidden, had been made undeniable. Meyer's work ensured that the law could now act where fear and silence had previously protected the guilty. The ordinary people who had once been powerless were finally represented. Justice, imperfect yet deliberate, had spoken. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video.